I'm on. Hello, it's George Gruhn at Gruhn Guitars, January 15th, 2021. And we live in interesting times, but I'm sure folks have been watching the news, so I don't need to comment on the news. So far as the guitar market, in spite of how crazy our political scene may be, and sometimes how uncertain people may feel about the economy, people still want guitars. And it's interesting enough that major guitar makers are back ordered and dealers are having trouble getting enough stock. So the demand is good and the guitar market is still alive and well. If anybody has questions that we don't get around to, keep in mind I'm reachable at the shop phone number 615-256-2033, and also email george@guitars.com. And I'm happy to respond direct to anybody who reaches out to me either of those ways. So questions don't have to wait for next week necessarily if there's something you need a quick answer on. And if there's anything I don't get around to, by all means, feel free to email me. Alan asks, are there preferred woods for solid acoustic guitars, i.e. Sitka versus mahogany, etc.? Are laminates inferior to solid wood? Well, in general, laminates are inferior to solid wood. And expensive instruments typically do not have laminated back and sides, with some notable exceptions. For example, the original McAfee and Selmer guitars, such as what Django Reinhardt played, did have laminated backs and sides, but they were not laminated with just a thin paper, thin veneer, just to give you the look of rosewood or the look of maple. It was typically mahogany on the inside and maple or rosewood on the outside. And it was 2 plies, and the plies were of equal thickness. And it was done for structural stability. And also it did actually give a good sound. And the rosewood or maple did contribute to the tonal difference. And so that actually does matter. But most laminate guitars that are student models have a just paper thin outer veneer to give the appearance of pretty wood on the outside. And that really does not impact the sound. But in general, since they're using inferior quality wood for the laminations compared to good solid rosewood or good solid maple, they just don't sound as good. And laminated top wood, I think, is unquestionably not as good sounding as solid spruce or cedar. Solid tops are better for acoustic instruments. Brian Rucker says, Bailey and Santa Cruz are producing guitars with prehistoric woods such as ancient kauri and ghost oak. Are these woods really sonically superior? What physical characteristics of the wood make them superior? Well, Santa Cruz has offered some guitars with so-called ancient Sitka, frozen in Alaska for supposedly 3,000 years. I know that some of the other makers, Santa Cruz also has some ghost oak. There's oak that came out of peat bogs. It is also supposed to be several thousand years old. And I have seen and played a few of these things. And in general, my feeling is ancient Sitka may sound a little bit better than modern growth Sitka. But in my opinion, I'd much prefer to have old growth Adirondack spruce, which is still available is not ancient or semi-fossilized, and sounds great. And I have yet to hear any old, ancient wood that sounds truly better to my ear than Adirondack spruce for the top. Bedell also has had some guitars made with ancient wood, including Kauri, which is New Zealand and supposedly was buried for over 5,000 years. I'm skeptical about some of that stuff. For one thing, the structural stability of wood that is that old is not necessarily going to be as good as well-seasoned wood that may be 100 or 200 years old. But when it gets into several thousand years, the stuff can be fragile. Certainly Viking boats that are found, that have been dug up, they're very fragile. And they have to be well cared for in a museum setting or they fall apart quickly. Things brought out of old Egyptian tombs, that wood is very fragile. And of course, similar fibers, cellulose, paper. We know that paper doesn't last forever, especially unless it's acid-free, and even then it doesn't last forever. Even ancient parchments or old manuscripts, they get very fragile and you can't handle them. I remember one time, my girlfriend had a antique clothing shop back in the 1970s. And one time she came across a stash of pre-Civil War era quilts, beautiful handcrafted quilts that had been stored in a cedar chest for basically well over 100 years. And we thought it would be great to put one on the bed. And while they looked great for display, actual wear and tear of using one, things started to fall apart in less than 6 months. I have played some guitars with ancient wood, and my feeling still is that I would rather have a guitar with well-seasoned, fine Adirondack spruce for the top. There are other woods that sound good. Obviously, well-seasoned European alpine spruce is great. Carpathian spruce is great. I've heard some fine guitars with cedar, and some of that wood, if you count the growth rings, where some of the cedar grew extremely slow and the tree was obviously over 1,000 years old, you could say that wood is already ancient when you first cut the tree. The wood in the middle of that tree can be 1,000 years old. But do I think that the ancient wood is something that is going to give you an immensely superior sound? I think not. But there certainly are boutique makers getting big money for it. But for the most part, those instruments are sold to folks who are going to put it in a glass display case and talk about it rather than play it. And also, is the ancient wood physically prettier? Does it look attractive? And for the most part, the wood that has been buried underground for over 1,000 years is very murky, dark colored. The grain pattern does not come out as being particularly pretty. And so I think physically it's not beautiful. So far as dollar price, it's very expensive. And does it sound better to my ear? No. And I'll leave it at that. Jerry Black asked for my thought on Waterloo mandolins, and I make it a practice not to comment on instruments that I've never played. I've seen plenty of Waterloo guitars. They're good quality. Have I seen a Waterloo mandolin? The answer is no. And can I comment on the quality of an instrument that I've not seen? I can only say that since Waterloos are made by Collings, the workmanship should be good. But how does a Waterloo mandolin sound? The answer is I don't know. John, when a customer purchases a new guitar that is shown in your catalog, are they typically shipped from your inventory or direct from the manufacturer to the customer? Well, we can get rid of the word typically. The answer is never. Manufacturers such as Martin, Fender, Collings do not ship. They don't drop ship the guitars direct to the customer. If it's on our inventory list, we have the guitar physically here in stock. Paul asks, you have said several times over the past weeks that the 1970s marked a low point in the story of the American guitar. In light of this, I'd be interested to hear your comments regarding brands like Hamer and BC Rich that appeared in response to the lapse in quality by market leaders like Gibson and Fender. Hamer in particular offered high quality instruments. Indeed, in the late 1970s, a Hamer Standard cost $1,199.95, significantly more than a Gibson Les Paul. It might also be argued that these brands paved the way for boutique manufacturers like PRS, Suhr, and Tom Anderson, lending them a degree of historical significance. In your opinion, do they have collectability over and above their utility value? Well, there's sort of several questions within the question. Do I feel that Hamer or BC Rich helped to pave the way for PRS or Suhr or Anderson? No, I don't. I would say that PRS was influenced by Gibson and Fender and by the fact that they, Paul Reed Smith saw a market opening for something that was better. And at that time, Gibson was owned by Norlin when he opened up the company, and their quality had suffered. Also, under Norlin, the company was suffering financially and was on the brink of collapse. And Norlin really wanted to sell the company. And when they did sell the company at the beginning of '86 to Henry Juskowitz and his two partners at the time, they sold it very cheap at $5 million and self-financed it. In other words, no money down. So they darn near gave it away. But PRS did not in any way copy Hamer or BC Rich. And I would say the same for Tom Anderson and Suhr. Their experience was primarily with Fender, and they were not at all trying to copy either Hamer or BC Rich. Some of the early Hamer guitars, the one that looked very much like a Les Paul Special double cut, actually wasn't even, the bodies were not even made by Hamer. Those bodies and necks were made in Nashville by Tom Holmes and shipped in the white, no electronics and no finish. They were shipped to Hamer in Chicago, and Hamer lacquered them and installed hardware and pickups, but they didn't even actually make the guitar. I do believe that Hamer actually made their Explorer and V type guitars, but the one that looked like a Les Paul Special, I personally saw them being made in Nashville. But again, and also so far as collectability, are the early Hamers bringing big bucks, or the early BC Rich models bringing big bucks? The answer is no, they're not. They're selling primarily based on utilitarian appeal. And I have not seen the really high collectible type prices being asked for either BC Rich or older Hamers. So I think that there was already a movement taking place where both acoustic and electric makers were coming onto the scene, and part of it was in response to the fact that the quality was poor, but it was also a response in part, not only was the quality poor, but the company management at Fender under CBS and with Gibson under Norlin was at an all-time low. Both companies were on the brink of collapse, as well as Guild under Avnet's ownership was also on the brink of collapse. And interestingly enough, right about the time that PRS came out with the guitars, Gibson, Fender, and Guild changed ownership. Bill Schultz and his group acquired Fender from CBS in '85, which is the same year that Paul Reed Smith first introduced his guitars at the NAMM show, in the summer NAMM show in New Orleans that year. It's also, I think, the only year they had a NAMM show in New Orleans, but I remember it well because I was there and I saw that opening exhibit. And Gibson sold at the beginning of '86 to Henry Juskowitz and his two partners. And Guild was sold by Avnet to a group out of Chattanooga that I was actually involved with in August of '86, but much of the year '86 was in negotiation over that purchase. So far as quality, the BC Rich was good quality, but not outstandingly better than a Gibson or a Fender. But they were different. They were sold more on the basis, not simply of quality, but they were different. They were more into the metal image. They were not copies of Gibsons or Fenders, and they were selling because it was a good guitar, but also a totally different marketing approach than either Fender or Gibson. They looked and felt completely different. And I would say also that Hamer was doing primarily models that Gibson no longer was producing at the time they started out. Or at least not producing in great quantity. When Hamer first came out with a guitar that looked like either a V or an Explorer, the selection of that type guitar from Gibson was very limited, and the guitars that looked like a Les Paul Special, the double cutaway Special, were something that Gibson wasn't offering at the time. So they were different. They were good quality, but also different. But still, those guitars are not selling for premium collectible prices today. They're selling more based on utility. The quality of craftsmanship overall from all the manufacturers today in the US is better than it was in the '70s. And it isn't even just guitars. If you went to craft fairs in the '70s, most of the stuff, glasswork, metalwork, jewelry, pottery, you name it, it was what I call the hippy-dippy school of craftsmanship. And by now, many of the makers who started out teaching themselves because the apprenticeship system was gone and there was nobody to teach you, they have reinvented the craft where now you can buy good engraving tools, good woodworking tools that were hard to get in the '70s, but readily available now. And there are even schools that teach crafts, and you can find that there are folks today doing beautiful glass blowing, pottery, jewelry work, and stuff that was not so readily available back in the 70s or even into the early 80s, but that is very much available today. Joe says, I have a 1960 solid body Gibson that hasn't been played in a long time. When I last picked it up and tried to tune it, I became very apprehensive as the strings tightened, and I still had a ways to go before I reached proper pitch. I stopped, not in fear of breaking a string, but I didn't know if I would cause any other damage. I'm asking your opinion on how to handle this situation. A 1960 Gibson, if it has been cared for, should not be any more fragile than a new one. If the strings haven't been changed in the last decade, it would make sense to put new strings on. But if you tune up those old strings, if one breaks, well, it's not going to, the point is the old string is not going to have more tension on it than a new one. If the string is in poor condition and breaks, so be it. You can, but we would recommend putting new strings on. If the guitar hasn't been played in over a year, there's probably enough corrosion that the strings aren't going to sound great, even if you do tune them. But the guitar, if it is in physically good condition, should tune up just fine. But if it has been a long, long time, it wouldn't hurt to take it to a competent repairman and have it checked out and make sure that it doesn't have any loose glue seams or any other such problems. On a solid body electric, it's highly unlikely to have such problems, but on an acoustic, if you have a guitar that has been, say you have a 1970 guitar or a 1960 guitar, 1960 is, after all, 61 years ago right now. 1970 is 51 years ago. If a guitar hasn't been played in 51 years or 61 years, especially on an acoustic, there may be some loose glue seams, the bridge may be coming loose, and it wouldn't hurt to have it inspected. If it's something like a Les Paul, it is highly unlikely that it has any problem whatever tuning it up. Solid body Gibson electric guitars from 1960, in all probability, and 99.9% sure that you should be able to tune it up without having to worry about anything breaking. But on an acoustic of that age that hasn't been played in that many years, you might want to have it checked out. There's a lot more glue seams that could have come loose. But at any rate, not to worry about it much. Kevin, which is more important in an acoustic instrument, volume, tone, resonance, or sustain? I assume all four are different. Can one or more of these be improved? If so, how? I'm particularly curious about sustain and if that can be improved. Choice of string material, steel, bronze, nickel, nanowire, bridge wood, bridge design. Well, I listen typically for balance, and balance is several categories of balance. Balance of volume, string to string, and notes up and down the board. Balance of sustain, do all notes sustain equal length? Do they fade equally? Infinite sustain on an acoustic is likely to be problematic. You want clarity of articulation, and if things ring too long, that can also have its own issues. But resonance is a somewhat vague term as to exactly what is resonance. I listen, again, for volume, sustain, dynamic range. Can you play it soft, medium, and loud without distortion and get good tone at all volumes? That's important. Complexity of the note, which probably is what you may be thinking of as resonance, but what are the harmonic frequencies? And does the note have a good, strong fundamental, but also have clear, good harmonic response above and below the fundamental? If it has good harmonic response and good sustain, that essentially is probably what you may be calling resonance. And lastly, complexity, not complex, but clarity of articulation. Are all notes crisp and clear? You can always use the palm of your hand and muddy up a note. So far as can you improve an existing instrument by string choice, certainly some strings sound different and you can experiment with string gauges. Some guitars respond best with light gauge. Some respond best with medium gauge. If it's a Dreadnought Martin guitar, most Dreadnought guitars that bluegrass players want are going to respond best with medium strings. But some of the smaller body guitars that are finger picking special guitars rather than flat picking guitars really respond best with light gauge. And it's best to try to figure out what is the sound your instrument was really designed to do. What is its best voice? And then play music that suits that. If you want to play bluegrass music, a single O size Martin is probably not what you want. You'd probably want a Dreadnought, but you're going to probably use a flat pick on a Dreadnought. You can finger pick a Dreadnought and you can get a good response for some type playing, but there's certain types of music that really do sound best with light strings on a smaller body guitar. They're not created to do the same thing. That's why some guitars can have maple back and sides and some mahogany and some rosewood, different tones, but there's more than one type of music. Blues and bluegrass, ragtime, classical, they're different types of music that can be equally good, but they don't necessarily sound best on the same guitar. If there was one type acoustic that did everything best, we wouldn't need so many different makers, nor so many different models by the same makers. You know, companies like Martin and Gibson make dozens of different model acoustic and electric guitars. And obviously, there are many, many different types of music, even within electric as well as acoustic. You know, people who want to play mellow jazz don't want the same guitar as people who play heavy metal. And people who play heavy metal may not want the same guitar that a good R&B player will want either. And classic rock has many different tones. Some people like twang. Some people want more mellow, but there's a use for the sound that a Rickenbacker has or that a Fender has. Telecasters don't sound like Les Pauls. They can both sound great. They may even be equally great, but they're not the same. And some great players prefer a Tele, and some great players prefer a Les Paul, but typically they're not looking for the same tone. They're not playing quite the same style of music. But so far as bridge design, you're getting into something sticky here. If you have a collectible quality, fine vintage instrument, I do not recommend changing the maker's specifications. And virtually any time you do that, you risk making it not sound as good as it did previously, but you almost certainly will reduce its monetary value. And if you have a guitar that simply doesn't satisfy you and it doesn't do what you want, rather than hot rodding and customizing it, you're usually better off to trade it for something that does suit you. But don't try to make your single O Martin sound like a Dreadnought, or make your Les Paul sound like a Tele, or your Tele sound like a Les Paul. If you have a pre-CBS Fender Strat, don't put humbucking pickups in it, or don't put single coil pickups in a nice Sunburst Les Paul Standard. If you want to have a Fender look and have humbucking pickups, there are some new Fenders that do that. And there's also plenty of companies that will make what you want, or you can buy necks and bodies. There are companies like Warmoth and Boogie Bodies that they offer these parts. You want to customize, you make a guitar where you just buy the kit and you buy all the component parts and assemble what you want. Great, but don't take an old one to do that. You will ruin its value. I remember vividly numerous enough times seeing guitars, like somebody came into one guitar show I was at, they had an original reverse body, early 60s Firebird 5 Gibson, which today would be worth close to $15,000, but they'd taken the vibrato tailpiece off of it and put on a stop tailpiece, drilled big holes in it. He says, well, I just had to do it. I couldn't play it the way it was. It just didn't suit me. Well, yeah, but he took a guitar that today would bring $15,000 and turned it into something that had utilitarian value and no collectible appeal, and would be worth maybe 1/3 as much as if he'd left it alone. You know, if the guitar doesn't suit you for what it is and can't be set up without doing irreversible changes, don't do that. If there's a component part, like on a Fender guitar, you want to try out different design bridge saddles, well, you can unscrew the originals and you can put on the new component and keep the originals, and you've not done any violence to the instrument. You can convert it right back. You haven't cut anything, you haven't routed anything, you haven't drilled any new holes. You can try that. But when you get into irreversible changes, I think that should be a no-no. And I would also add that in many ways, I do view guitars as almost alive, and that on a vintage instrument, we are the custodian of that guitar. But that guitar has a life expectancy with good care of several hundred years. Therefore, no owner should irreversibly alter it in such a way that it no longer matches original specs and no longer would have appeal to future generations. In effect, we are the custodian. And if we don't take good care of it, we are doing something that I think is an offense against future generations. A question from Tim. Can you speak generally about Tonewoods and get more specific on popular choices? Recently I asked about oak, and you referred me to a company who's made some with oak. But I remain unclear what keeps some of these commonly available woods from projecting good sound and making them a marketable choice. While Brazilian rosewood isn't available in new guitars, it seems other versions of rosewood are available. Aside from visual appeal, why would East Indian rosewood offer warmer sound than another variety? Meanwhile, some woods are quite pretty, but don't seem to prove popular for tonal qualities. Is that popularity strictly in the ears of the beholder? If I were Martin, I'd have a ton of inventory of bird's eye maple if I couldn't sell. But if I couldn't sell the instrument, bird's eye maple is stupendous. Is bird's eye maple stupendous in tonal quality? And okay. Indian rosewood can sound really good. And in fact, I think Indian rosewood gives a sound that, while it's different from Brazilian a bit, still is remarkably comparable in quality. And I think is fully as good as Madagascar rosewood. Madagascar rosewood is very endangered. It's also now very expensive. It looks very similar to Brazilian rosewood, more so than Indian rosewood does, but it doesn't sound like Brazilian rosewood. And there's Guatemalan and Honduran and other rosewoods and Cocobolo that also sound good, but do they necessarily sound better than high quality Indian? I think that may be debatable. There are other woods such as oak that I have heard guitars made out of oak that were quite good, and walnut for back and sides. I would not use oak or walnut for tops. Top to me should be spruce or cedar. And there are also different species of spruce and cedar. I'm a big fan of Adirondack spruce, but Carpathian spruce and alpine spruce are very fine. Engelmann spruce is softer, and I personally don't like it as well. Lutz spruce, which is a hybrid of Sitka and white spruce, actually is a good sounding wood, but I still prefer Adirondack or, you know, again, my favorite spruces are alpine, Carpathian, and Adirondack. But also redwood can give a good sound, although I've never played personally a redwood guitar with ancient or modern redwood that I personally liked as well as good Adirondack. But I happen to like a very crisp, clearly articulated sound. And Adirondack spruce gives great dynamic range as well as great volume and great clarity. So it gives crisp, clear, plenty of volume, and great dynamic range. So, plus it looks good. But Sitka can also look good, and there's numerous topwoods that can look good. There's numerous backwoods that can sound good, and Ziricote, Macassar ebony can give good sound for backs and sides. And maple can certainly sound good, although maple and rosewood typically will have to be cut to different thickness to sound equally good. But again, that doesn't mean you can't do well with both. I mean, the finest violins in the world all have maple back and sides and have spruce tops. But again, there are actually a wide variety of woods that can give good sound. I've heard some guitars made with cherry that I thought sounded good, but I didn't like the cherry as well as I like walnut. And again, koa wood, Hawaiian koa wood is good. I personally don't like koa for the top as well as I like it for the back and sides. But many of the vintage koa guitars, Hawaiian style, have koa tops. And they do work well for Hawaiian style music, but I think you get more dynamic range with a spruce top. But there's room for differences of opinions. So Earl says, I know China's Eastman Guitar Company is gaining good quality, quality/price recognition, bang for buck. But does South Korea's Peerless guitars have the same quality reputation? I haven't played any Peerless lately. I do have familiarity with Peerless guitars made in the 1990s in Korea, and they were good quality. They were some of the better Korean guitars. These days, the labor costs in Korea are considerably higher than in China. And I have not seen much noise out of Peerless lately. And I doubt seriously that the new Peerless would be better than some of the finest ones out of China. In fact, some of my favorite ones out of China lately that I played are some from Altamira, but they're producing mostly classical and gypsy jazz guitars, but they're doing some very good guitars. John P. says most of the folks on the unofficial Martin guitar forum say that straight grain quarter sawn wood on the back and sides makes for superior guitar. What's your opinion? I noticed that the Sinker guitars range from straight to highly figured grain. Does it matter in regard to the long-term stability of the guitar or its tone? We do have some Sinker Martin, Sinker mahogany guitars that have quarter cut and some that have had slab. And for the back and sides, you can get very good stability out of wood that is not necessarily quarter cut. And often enough, the highly figured, beautiful grain comes out more prominently on the slab cut wood. But so far as tone and stability, we have not seen any significant difference on that. And on violins, there are plenty of very fine, extremely valuable old Italian violins that have slab cut maple, but they'll have quarter cut spruce. And on spruce, quarter cut is critically important. And yes, it makes a real difference. But on backs and sides, that is not necessarily the case. We did have a question last week that I didn't answer during that time, but they asked about a pretty guitar on the wall behind me, so I'll show it right now. And the question was, what is it? And this is a Prairie State guitar made by the Larson brothers of Chicago. This would be circa 1930. And you'll notice it has two metal bars inside the body, which you can see here. The larger one runs the full length of the body and provides as a stabilizer. Guitars tend over time to warp a bit with age. And this guitar was one that warped too easily. It's very strong. It also has laminated bracing and has a patent date of July 12, 1904 inside it. It is the patent for their laminated bracing. The Larsons were making steel string guitars that early. In fact, having a patent for their bracing design, which was quite unique. It also has the other smaller bar that goes all the way to the end pin, which you notice has an adjustment screw, and it loops around the heel of the neck. And it was designed that you could at least make a slight neck set adjustment, which I wouldn't dare use. But the guitar is in excellent playing order. And the Larsons happen to be one of my favorite makers. It's one of the few makers that I would say compares remarkably well to old Martins and Gibsons, but they have a unique sound of their own. They have a little bit of arch to the top and back, and they were, in fact, built under tension the way violins are, such that the bracing, actually, when you glue it in place, puts a bit of tension on the top, and that does actually permit it to vibrate differently. So that is a very interesting guitar, but that's one hanging on our wall that I happen to really like. It's a wonderful sounding instrument. It's 15 inches wide, and it has lots of volume and plenty of tone and sustain. It's to me, a truly superb instrument, and almost anything from the Larson brothers. They went out of business in the mid-40s because when Carl and August Larson died, once one of them died, the other gave up on it and died shortly thereafter. But they were in business from the early 1900s, very early 1900s, right on up through about 1944. Mike asks, do you think that an artist series guitar will retain its value as well or better than a regular series Martin of the same model of that same guitar? For instance, a Martin 0028 EC versus a standard Martin 0028. Well, the answer is in the case of the Clapton model and many of the others, the specs are not the same. You're not simply getting a guitar that looks like or is just looks a little different, it has somebody's name on it. It sounds different. And that does make a difference. One moment, please. Sarah. Picture disappeared from my screen. Something wrong.
Oh, shoot. Close.
What the hell is going on?
Hold on, Nick.
I'm on. Okay, the picture disappeared from my screen, so I was concerned as to whether I was still on. At any rate, the Martin 0028 EC is basically not the same neck dimension. It's not the same ornamentation. It is built to specs that Eric asked for, and it really is a different guitar from a standard 0028 of the same age, and the ornamentation as well as other features are different, and that will hold its value. Not every one of the artist series is going to be equally desirable, and you have to go guitar by guitar, but in general, the artist series guitars are good and will hold their value fully as well as a standard line Martin. And I have no trouble recommending that some of these are great guitars. Jeffrey asks, of all the guitars you have owned, what was the best, your favorite? Well, defining best is a sort of sticky wicket because I personally just am in love with my 1924 Lloyd Larson L5, but it's not the best guitar if you want to play bluegrass. It's probably not the best guitar if you want to play modern mellow jazz. And it certainly, as an acoustic archtop, is not the best guitar if you want to play heavy metal. There are so many different kinds of guitars. I love Martin guitars, particularly the steel string models made from about 1928 through late 1938. Those are some of, in my opinion, the finest steel string flat top guitars ever made. On the other hand, the Larson guitar I just showed is a fabulous guitar. And in its own way, it's right on up there with the Martins. And there's more than one good flavor. It's like, you know, what's the best flavor ice cream? Well, it might be boring to have only vanilla for your whole life, and vanilla is really good, but you know, Baskin Robbins has lots of flavors, Ben & Jerry has lots of flavors, and guitars come in lots of designs too, and many of them can be good. Donald Sarlin asks my opinion about good old guitars made in Hawaii by James Goodall. They're very good guitars. And I have had a moderate number of those go through here. I'm still a big fan of the vintage Martins and things built similar to that, and Goodalls are different. But are Goodalls plenty good? Yep, they are. They're expensive, they're good. I'm not carrying them new. They do well when I get a used one, but it's a fine instrument, but I'm not going to go beyond that. Jerry Black asks, are new Gallaghers great quality? The Gallagher company recently changed hands, and the owners have been over here and showed me some of their new guitars. And in my opinion, they are as good as, if not better than, any previous Gallaghers ever made. I think that the ones that have collectible appeal are primarily those made by J.W. Gallagher, who died in 1979. But the new Gallaghers that I played and saw were every bit as good, if not better, than the ones made by J.W. and were definitely, I think, superior to the ones made during Don Gallagher's tenure or during the time when Don's kids took over. So the new Gallaghers are good guitars. Lauren Harmon says, I have large hands and prefer a finger picking style. What brand of guitar in OM style should I look at? Price point 3,000 to 5,000. Well, there are numerous makers doing that. Martin makes good OM style guitars. Santa Cruz and Collings also do. We have OM model in Sinker mahogany that I think are great sounding guitars. I've sold them to some very good players, including Eric Clapton, who got one and likes it real well. And it's right within your price bracket at $3,850 with case. But there are multiple choices. The original OMs were Martin, and others who make OMs are basically modeling theirs after the original Martin. And you can still get an OM Martin from Martin, and they're good. But Collings and Santa Cruz are also good. So there's more than one choice out there. Steve Chrysophilie says, Adirondack is your preferred top wood, but is it true that the break-in time is longer than Sitka or other species? Well, I certainly hear that a lot. I just don't find that in actual practice, though. What I find is that the guitars with Adirondack spruce sound better than almost anything else to my ear on day one. They have good volume and good tone. And so far as break-in time, if you play them bare fingers, soft and dainty, they don't break in quickly. But if you pick them hard, at as loud as you can, almost to the point of obnoxious, and do that for only a few hours, they wake up. And every time you play a good acoustic guitar, I like to start out for the first few minutes warming it up by playing it hard. But the guitars I have custom shop with Adirondack spruce, typically with no more than 1 week of playing, are dramatically wide awake, enough to be remarkably different, and also enough to be so different that you can tell to within 5 minutes of when it happened. You can be playing a guitar, like I've had experience on a number of occasions, backstage at the Opry, take a guitar that I want to show around, and it sounds good. It's loud, it's good, people are enjoying it, but I get folks into a good jam session, and in the middle of a tune, you can tell to what verse he was playing when all of a sudden it's like the thing just shifts into overdrive, and wow, wham, people from even across the room look up and say, what happened? And they can hear the difference. It's that dramatic. And that's guitars that are still on their first set of strings, newly arrived, not broken in yet. So we're not talking about how many years does it take for the sound to improve. Now, it still can improve more over time, but does it have to be played for multiple years? No. I've also had folks say that cedar breaks in more quickly, but on a 20-plus-year-old guitar, it goes to the point of being past its prime. On the other hand, I've played some guitars that are older than 20 years with cedar tops, and they didn't seem worn out to me. It also depends on the kind of music you're playing. For example, flamenco guitar players typically don't want a really old guitar that's all mellowed out because flamenco isn't mellow. They want a guitar that's percussive. And there's a certain sound that's a really good sound that can come out of a lightly built spruce top flamenco guitar, because spruce tends to also give a more percussive sound than cedar, which is somewhat mellower sounding. And so the sound for classical and the sound for flamenco is different, but even on classical guitars, some classical players who like a bright sound say that a guitar can be past its prime. Well, some of those really old classics by master builders still happen to sound wonderful. So we can debate what tone one likes, but the fact is you can get very good sound on a guitar that was strung up for the first time no more than a week or two ago. And they will wake up quickly if they're played hard. And they will continue to improve a bit, but the most dramatic improvement happens to happen with hard playing in the first week, enough to be very notable. So do I think that Adirondack spruce is too slow to improve? No. And keep in mind also when Stradivari and Guarneri were making violins, their instruments had a reputation of sounding great when they were new. And there were already violins that were as much as 150 years old at that time. Stradivari died in 1737, but there were makers in the Amati family and also Maggini and De Salo that were making violins even in the 1550s. So there were instruments that were old when Stradivari and Guarneri were making new ones, and the new ones, to the ear of many players, sounded better. They had a different design. There was a lower arching and actually built a bit heavier. Sometimes built too light, doesn't project as well. But at any rate, you shouldn't have to wait for 40 or 50 years for it to sound its best, because the average life expectancy in Stradivari and Guarneri's day was no more than 40 years. And musicians didn't want to wait 40 years for it to sound good. And even today, even though our life expectancy is longer, we don't really want to wait 40 years for the guitar to sound good. And I can assure you that I've heard plenty of new guitars that sound really, really good quickly. If they don't sound good when they're new, don't count on them sounding wonderful later. James Watson asks, can you tell us a bit about your custom shop Gruhn 50th anniversary quadruple O Martins? Well, I guess we have something within reach. Let's see where one may be. Newly arrived question. Here be one. This is a quadruple O with the headstock that has the similar to the decal type lettering, but in abalone, and the torch similar to the 12 fret Martin style 45s, also what the OM 45 had, the style 45 snowflake inlays, style 45 inlay on the top, snowflakes on the bridge, and nicely figured sinker mahogany for the neck, back, and sides. So also the absolute highest grade, master grade spruce that Martin has. wood that the Martin rep, Jay Meyer, and I went up to the factory to hand select. And we made the 50th anniversary models in 14 fret D, 14 fret quadruple O, that's 16 inches wide, and in 12 fret slot head quadruple O. But all of them feature the same type work, the same quality ornamentation and craftsmanship, and we are proud of them. They are fine instruments. And we can certainly give more info if somebody wishes to call. Ray Whiteway, in your view, what is a vintage acoustic? Pre-60? Pre-50? Well, the answer is that I feel that the term vintage is becoming problematic. When I opened up my store in 1970, 1940 was only 30 years ago. But we knew darn well that was a golden era guitar. Now, a guitar made in 1970, well, that's 51 years ago. And is it a vintage guitar? No. Is it a golden era guitar? No. The fact is that vintage is not a particular number of years, but golden era is a more sensible term really these days, because also each maker has its own golden era. Some of the finest old Martins that are highly collectible were made in the 30s, or at least 28 through 38, but still the new Martins are extremely good. And the new Martins are some of the best made in my lifetime, and I was born in 45. Do I consider a 1945 guitar to be vintage? Well, yeah, but is it absolute golden era? No. It's still real good, and it's worth more money than a brand new one, as far as what the market will bear. But is a 1945 Martin with a Adirondack top but non-scallop bracing, is it really better than some of the new instruments? In my opinion, the answer is no. But it's better than a lot of new instruments. It's better maybe than most new instruments, but not better than all of them. Again, I've discussed this a number of times in previous weeks. So I'm not going to dwell too long on this, but the fact is, a guitar does not have to be a certain number of years old to be collectible. Collectible for somebody like Jimmy DeQuisto, he died in 1995. And his best ones that bring the most money are some of his latest ones. D'Angelico died in 64, and those bring more money than one made in 34. Stromberg, some of his most valuable guitars. Stromberg died, Elmer Stromberg died in 55, and Elmer was, even though the labels say Charles Stromberg and Son, Charles was mainly involved with drums and banjos, and Elmer's the one who really did the guitars. And Elmer died in 55, and for that matter, so did Charles. They both died in the same year, father and son. But some of the most valuable Strombergs are the last ones. Those made at least within the last 10 years or so are the most valuable of all the Strombergs, but certainly from 1940 through 55. Prior to 40, most of the Strombergs were laminate backs and sides, and often arched pressed tops rather than truly carved. And they bring decent money, but nowhere near as much as the later ones. And they're just not nearly as good a guitar as the later ones. Tim Carroll asks, is the theory that Martin dreadnoughts from 70 through 74 are of poor quality true or accurate? I've heard that the bridges were incorrectly installed, making it challenging to intonate the guitar. I own a 71 D28, and certainly does not seem to be the case with my guitar. Well, some of the guitars that Martin made, actually a lot of them back then, the bridges were placed slightly more distance from the 12th fret to the nut than from the nut to the 12th fret, with the theory that if you press down on the string, it'll sharp it a little bit. You need to compensate. And the Martins from the 70s typically do not intonate as well as the ones they make right now. These days too, with computer control, the fret slot cutting is very precise, and the new ones also have compensated bridge saddles. The intonation is better, but in general, my feelings about the guitars of 70 throughout the 70s are, one, they have rosewood bridge plates rather than maple, which is not as good for tone. They typically came set up with very high action on the theory that the dealer could set it where the customer wanted it, and they'd send it too high for anybody, and then you adjusted it down to whatever the guy wanted. So if they played bluegrass, they could have higher action than if they were a finger picker. But today they set them up more of an average of what most customers really want. So typically we don't have to do any setup work on a new Martin. But again, the Martins of the 70s do not have an adjustable truss rod. And they had black pick guards that tended to shrink with age, and they were glued firmly to the top so that when they did shrink, they could often cause the top to crack. So that could be a problem, but that was a problem with all early Martins, that the pick guards were glued firmly to the top. That's something they no longer do. They glue them over the finish with a glue that has some flex to it so that it will not ever cause the top to crack, even if the guard shrinks slightly. But the Martins of the 70s were well made, but typically also by now, as any acoustic guitar will, if it's 50 plus years old, and 1970 was 51 years ago, it's probably going to need a neck set. It didn't have an adjustable rod, so it very likely will need to have a plane and refret, whether the frets are worn or not. It may need that to get it adjusted well. And by the time you get done setting one up to play really optimally, may cost over $1,000. So it's something to be careful of when you are looking at any guitar, an acoustic that's 50 plus years old. You should check to at least be sure that everything is still in good working order, because they are old enough to probably need work. Brian O'Grady says, I read an expert recently mentioned how hard it can be to spot a well-done refinish. He was talking about pre-1965 thin lines in cherry. Has it ever happened to you that you didn't spot one? And what would you do if you later found out months after a sale? Well, I recall one time having a conversation with a dealer in New York that heard me say that I'm having increasing difficulty sometimes telling an original custom color Fender from an expert refinish. It used to be, when I started out in business, it could pretty well tell a refinish. It looked like barn paint applied with a broom, and nobody was good at doing it. And if it looked factory quality, it probably was original. But as guitars got more expensive and as people got more skilled in craftsmanship, as I was saying earlier in this session, I was talking about how We no longer have the hippy-dippy school of craftsmanship these days. We have people who really know what they're doing. At any rate, the New York dealer said, George, yeah, what is it? You're just getting old and not sure of yourself anymore. You know, I've never been fooled by one. What's your problem? Well, that's a strange statement of I've never been fooled. Anybody who thinks they've never been fooled, how would you know if you were fooled? If nobody ever called your attention to it, if nobody ever proved you wrong, by definition, you wouldn't know. And even today, there's museums finding that some of their supposed vintage great paintings are in fact forgeries. So we keep learning. You know, sometimes I think experts talk, so a cartoon today, I don't have it with me right now, but it was in today's Tennessean, the Dilbert cartoon said that experts will opine about that which has already been done, but people creating new stuff, people who know all about the past are experts. People who are creating, they're entrepreneurs. And so people who know about the future or what's going on right now, they may well be entrepreneurs. At any rate, is it possible, is there one simple way to be sure that something is a refinish? Well, if you see orange peely finish on a Martin or a Fender, you can be pretty damn sure it's not original. If you open up the cavities inside, you know, pop the pick guard off of a Fender and look at the routing in the cavities, there's pretty distinctive look to that that is real hard to duplicate on a refinish. So you look at the areas that are not necessarily visible, but at least unless you start taking things apart and looking in there, you can also look sometimes at whether, if a guitar has any checking or aging. There are some types of checking patterns that just don't happen on the original finishes. They do check, but the checking pattern looks different. And is it the right consistency? You can look, some finishes just don't look right. But in general, the more skilled the forger is, or the refinisher is, the better it is. And I've told it before and I'll tell it again. Tom Murphy is one of the best refinishers anywhere. Told me the story of buying a pre-CBS Fender at a guitar show and he didn't take it apart. It looked perfect. And he does this for a living. He's one of the finest finish people there is. And he works now for Gibson doing their relic finishes. And he bought the guitar because it was priced sensibly. So where he thought he could make a little bit of money. He had somebody who would want it. But when he got it home, you know, it had a little bit of crackling in the pots. He thought he'd clean it. So he took the pick guard off and was going to get in there to clean it. And there was a signature inscribed into the finish under the pick guard. And it was his own name, signed exactly the way he would do when he refinished a guitar. So his own work fooled him, because now it was a few years later, he didn't remember the guitar, but it had a little bit more wear. And his finishes, from the outside at least, look great. So at any rate, anybody who thinks they've never been fooled is either concealing the truth or mistaken. I've been in business for 51 years, and I've been collecting instruments from 1963 to the present. And I can assure you that while I have a very good track record, I am not about to claim that I am infallible or omniscient. If and when I become omniscient, by definition, I would know at the moment it happened, because after all, being omniscient, I would know. And if it happens, I will immediately let everyone know. In the meantime, I will admit that I am a fallible mortal being, but I still do my best. I've spent years studying. I would like to think I'm pretty good at what I do, and I keep striving to learn more. And there's not a day that goes by that I don't learn something new. And once in a while, learning something new involves having to change an opinion. But I'm still open to that. So, at any rate, we've covered a lot of good territory. And I'll look forward to getting with you again next week. And until then, I can say between this week and next week at this time, there will have been a presidential inauguration. We will hope it goes through without violence. And we'll hope that the threat of violent uprisings in all 50 state capitals does not come true. We'll hope for, let's say, a bit more civility and sanity coming. But what we do know is we live in interesting and tumultuous times. And the coming week, between now and next Friday, when I'll be talking to you again, we know that there will be some major changes in the world. And we hope that it will not be a cataclysmic earthquake that's going to hurt people. But till then, take care of yourself. Good luck to all of us. Thank you for joining in.